Gobble Gobble, folks, and welcome back to our journey across the United States. Thanksgiving. When you say that word, probably whether you're in or outside of America at this point, it elicits imagery of turkeys, pilgrims, families coming together, and the like for many. That said, regardless of what you think about this holiday, Thanksgiving has a rich history that goes much further back than you think, and in some ways, further back than America. And I thought I'd tell all of you awesome people who I am thankful for some strange history about this holiday that you may not have known. Anyhow, as a quick aside, if you are thankful for me this holiday, it would help me out a ton if you liked this video, commented, and subscribed. It's just a quick way to tell YouTube, gobble gobble, this guy's alright. With that, come with me today and let's explore some of Thanksgiving's weird lore. To start this video off, even though most videos on this channel have been about America, I think I need to shatter our American-centric view of the Thanksgiving holiday, and give folks, whether they love Thanksgiving or not, a refresher on where Thanksgiving actually comes from. See, before the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag had their semi-fictional feast that you watched on Cartoon Network every year as a kid, the idea of a day of Thanksgiving wasn't limited to what we know as the first Thanksgiving in 1621. In contrast, there were actually various traditions of giving thanks that were practiced by different cultures around the world, and later in what became the United States long before it became a formalized holiday in the 19th century. For instance, you may often see St. Martin's Day referred to as the European Thanksgiving. St. Martin's Day centers on St. Martin of Tours, a 4th century Roman soldier who became a Christian monk and later a bishop. He's best known for the story in which he cut his military cloak in half to share with a freezing beggar, an act of compassion that, according to legend, prompted a vision of Christ wearing the portion that he'd given away. His reputation for humility, charity, and service to the poor spread across Europe, and after his death he became one of the most beloved saints of the Middle Ages. Because his feast day already falls on November 11th, right after harvest season, his legacy of generosity naturally blended with the agrarian traditions of giving thanks for the year's abundance. As a result, St. Martin's Day, often nicknamed European Thanksgiving as they said, developed into a celebration of gratitude, community, and sharing. Now, customs vary substantially by region, but common elements include processions with lanterns carried by children, reenactments of St. Martin's sharing his cloak, and festive meals, often featuring roast goose, new wine from the year's harvest, and seasonal autumn dishes. In many towns, people gather for bonfires on this day, music, and community events that emphasize kindness and giving to those in need. The day serves both as a cultural marker of the transition into winter and a reminder of St. Martin's enduring message to show generosity and warmth to others. Further, and this very much contrasts American Thanksgiving, many days of Thanksgiving were actually declared in England by the English government in the days preceding the discovery of America. These days, while being called Days of Thanksgiving in name, were unlike our modern Thanksgiving. They were spent in church, and they weren't necessarily days of fasting, but they were days where you spent so much time in church that you didn't have time to cook or eat. They absolutely weren't feast days or harvest celebrations in the slightest, but rather devoted to recognizing and thanking God. Further, there are even Thanksgivings in America that actually predate modern Thanksgiving. For instance, in 1565, in then Spanish Florida, the first recorded day of Thanksgiving in the Americas would take place. We know of this event through the accounts of Pedro Menendez de Avila, the man who founded St. Augustine, which tells that as soon as the landing party basically came ashore, they would place out a meal, to which he actually invited the native Seloy tribesmen who occupied the site, feeding them what they had aboard their ships, which we weren't told explicitly, but from our knowledge of the period, we can assume was likely a stew made from salted pork and garbanzo beans, seasoned with garlic, accompanied by something like sea biscuits and some red wine. Further, if the natives contributed, which we're not sure they did, it was probably turkey, venison, gopher, tortoise, mullet drum, sea catfish, maize, beans, and squash that they provided. Again, this day of Thanksgiving was probably much more like the European variety, being more a religious ceremony than a harvest feast, though, in this case, food was at least involved. Heck, even prior to Thanksgiving held by the Plymouth colonists, you can see evidence of a pre-Thanksgiving Thanksgiving in the American colonies. In 1619, English settlers at the Berkeley Plantation near modern-day Richmond, Virginia, would hold a formal day of Thanksgiving to celebrate their own safe arrival into the New World, and the Virginia Company of London, which sponsored this settlement, would actually require the settlers mark this day annually as one of thanksgiving to God in the years to follow. So, to sum this all up, Thanksgivings vary wildly, and they far predate what was practiced by the Pilgrims of New England. And even following what they practiced, Thanksgivings remained different. For example, in 1789, following the U.S.'s independence, President George Washington himself would actually declare November 26th of 1789 as a national day of Thanksgiving, which he said should be devoted by the people of these states to the service of that great and glorious being, who is the beneficent author of all the good that was, that is, or that will be. So again, it wasn't a formalized national holiday, but it was rather a celebration by the nation of the newly formed republic, with a religious tone, and this setting, the fourth Thursday of November in 1789, was actually the inspiration for Sarah Josepha Hale, the actual person who went on a crusade to found the modern Thanksgiving, to choose the fourth Thursday of November as the date upon which Thanksgiving should fall. But we'll talk more about that part in a second. So, something I've always found fascinating about Thanksgiving is its duality in terms of lore. On one hand, we have this massive mythos about it, which we've painted across American culture, where the Pilgrims took this long journey over to the Americas, and then they had a really tough winter, and then after making it through the winter, they'd meet Squanto, a friendly English-speaking native who would teach them how to grow crops in the New England soil, and help them form a union with the Wampanoag tribe. Later this year, of course, the Pilgrims, in large part due to the help they received from the native people, would have a bountiful crop, and in thanks, they'd invite their native allies to a feast they'd hold at their newfound colony. That said, despite this rich history that's told time and time again at the dinner table and recounted in cartoons and art pieces, we know pretty much nothing about this original celebration, and pretty much every single detail we do know comes from one of two sources. Number one, the Edward Winslow letter, or his writing in Mort's Relation, and two, William Bradford's writing in Of Plymouth Plantation. Here, I'll describe the facts that we actually know about this first Thanksgiving, directly from these two true sources on it. To start, we'll talk about the Edward Winslow letter about Thanksgiving. This letter is dated December 11th of 1621, and here Edward updates a friend back in England about life in the new Plymouth colony in 1621. He explains that even though the settlers have only been there a short time, they've already built several houses and planted crops like corn, barley, and peas, fertilizing them with fish the way the local Native Americans taught them. He also states the harvest turned out pretty well, especially the corn, and to celebrate, the governor sent out men hunting, and they gathered enough fowl to feed the colony for nearly a week. Then, and this part is pretty funny to me, as their men were hunting, and I quote, exercising their arms, many Native Americans would come and greet the colonists, 90 of them to be precise, and they'd go out themselves and kill 5 deer and accompany the Plymouth colonists for 3 days. The writer says that although supplies aren't always abundant, they have plenty right now, and often wish their friends in England could share in it. He also describes the colonists' peaceful relationships with the Native Americans, who have proven friendly, trustworthy, and eager to maintain alliances. He says the climate, too, is similar to England's, but perhaps a bit hotter in the summer, and that the land is full of fish, fowl, fruits, and herbs, and there's enormous potential if more hard-working people would come. He then recounts how a supply ship unexpectedly arrived in November of 1621, and how the colonists prepared for possible danger before realizing it was friendly. He then gives practical advice for anyone planning to sail over, what food, tools, and supplies to bring, and ends by hoping to see his friends in the next group of arrivals. Further, in this letter there's a brief description, not necessarily of food they ate at their feast, but of food that's available, which included cod in the summer, lobsters that were plentiful in the bay, other fish, fowl, mussels, a variety of berries, and plums. There's a little more to this letter, but that's honestly the summary of the description of the first Thanksgiving in this letter, with some other details thrown in too. Then, as I stated, there's also the writing of William Bradford, the governor of the Plymouth colony, so the literal guy in charge during the first Thanksgiving. Bradford, like Winslow, actually came aboard the Mayflower in 1620, and he was elected governor in 1621 after the original governor of the colony, John Carver, passed away. Eventually, he'd actually write a book called Of Plymouth Plantation, which was a first-hand account of early Plymouth life, and while it doesn't give the same level of detail about this first Thanksgiving that the Winslow letter did, he'd write about the harvest of 1621 and how the colonists reacted to finally having enough food after a brutal first winter. Bradford explains that the Pilgrims planted corn using techniques they learned from the Native Americans, and with God's help, the crops grew well. After gathering their harvest, the colonists decided to take a few days' break to relax, give thanks, and enjoy the results of their hard work. Then he says that the men of the colony went out hunting and brought back fowl, just like the Winslow letter, very likely ducks, geese, and maybe wild turkeys, and that during this time Massasoit, the Wampanoag leader, arrived with about 90 people. He also notes that they stayed for several days and contributed themselves to the celebration by hunting and bringing 5 deer as gifts to the colonists. Bradford's account is short, factual, and not flowery in the slightest. And that's pretty much it. Those sparse and, dare I say, identical records are literally all we know about the first Thanksgiving. Full stop. So to summarize, the colonists had a good crop, and they thought, hey, let's have a feast. And they actually didn't originally intend to have the native people attend this feast at all. That said, their firearms going off attracted the natives, and these natives, perhaps interpreting the weapons being used as a show of strength, assembled a party of 90 men to confront the Plymouth colonists, who were about half their size and number. Then they realized what exactly was going on and sort of said, well, that's a nice feast you've got there. It would be a shame if someone ate a whole lot of it. And they were nice enough to contribute to the feast with deer and presumably some other food rather than taking the show of force as a threat and doing away with them. So that, my friends, is the real story of the first Thanksgiving, which, as we talked about before, wasn't really the first Thanksgiving anyways, and admittedly, it might be more aptly described as a amiable hostage situation than a feast between neighbors. But anyhow, let me know, did you know this story, and do you interpret it the same way I do? So if you're a football fan like me, you know that football and Thanksgiving go together like bread and butter. At least for enthusiasts like myself, it's an annual tradition I can't really miss, especially watching the Detroit Lions take the field every Thanksgiving. Most people think this tradition started in 1934, when the Detroit Spartans, yes, they were called the Spartans back then, hosted the NFL champions, the Chicago Bears. But there's more to this story. If the first Thanksgiving game was between the Spartans and Bears, why don't these teams still meet up on Thanksgiving? Well, the answer takes us back a bit, and it actually leads us to Ohio. Few know that the Detroit Spartans, who eventually became the modern-day Detroit Lions, were preceded by a professional football team from Portsmouth, Ohio, the Portsmouth Spartans. Founded in 1928, the Spartans became part of the NFL in 1930. They played in what is now Spartan Municipal Stadium, which, after the team left, was primarily used for high school football games and is now owned by Shawnee State University. You might think, wow, Portsmouth was way too small for an NFL team, and you'd be right, but at the time, Portsmouth was actually larger than Green Bay, which also had an NFL team. And there's also another important piece of this puzzle, the Ironton Tanks, a semi-professional team from Ironton, Ohio. Formed in 1919, the Tanks were so good, they beat NFL teams like the Chicago Bears and the New York Giants. And between 1919 and 1930, they were a prominent semi-professional football team and even started the tradition of Thanksgiving Day football with a 1922 game against the Huntington Boosters, another semi-pro team. That said, when the Tanks dissolved in 1930, many of their players joined the nearby Portsmouth Spartans, who later moved to Detroit in 1934 and then became the Detroit Spartans. Now, as the new franchise owner, G.A. Richards was looking for ways to boost ticket sales, former Ironton Tanks players suggested they should schedule a Thanksgiving Day game. They remembered how much success they'd had with Thanksgiving games in the past, so Richards took their advice, and the first Thanksgiving Day game in Detroit was born. And NBC aired the game nationally, cementing the tradition we still enjoy today. So, in short, if you're a die-hard football fan, and you look forward to the annual Lions game, even if you're a proud Michigander who cherishes the rivalry with Ohio, it might be worth setting aside a bit of pride to thank Ohio now and again for helping make this great tradition possible. Black Friday, my least favorite holiday, if you can even call it that. Only a madman would deliberately follow up a day that's largely devoted to family, food, and enrichment in modern day with one deliberately aimed at consumerism. But I digress. Hate it or not, I think we can all agree that Black Friday's origin is something that people simply can't get straight. Just take a look at the many Reddit posts about the origin of Black Friday, for instance. They are all over the board. The most common explanation for the holiday I found is the explanation that the term was coined because back in the day, retailers went from using red ink, denoting they were operating at a loss, to black ink, indicating in their books they made a profit due to the increase in sales over the holidays. But, in addition to this, I found another story claiming that Black Friday's origins date back to sales on slaves in the 1800s, and that in the late fall, prior to a looming harsh winter, slaves might sometimes be sold off at a discount on Fridays in November and December rather than care for them over the winter months. So, what is it? Is there truth to either of these stories? And honestly, where does the term actually come from? Well, in reality, neither of these stories, the most common two I found, are actually true. And, as is sort of common in folklore that drives culture, the true origin of the term Black Friday is more nuanced, niche, and admittedly pretty forgettable. The oldest known mention of the term Black Friday in the USA goes back to 1869, when on September 24th of that year, there was a gold panic in the USA, which triggered a brief financial crisis. To describe this crisis, basically it was a conspiracy between Jay Gould, James Fisk, and Abel Corbin, who essentially attempted to corner the US gold market in 1869 by manipulating both gold supplies and political influence. See, back in the day, during Ulysses S. Grant's presidency, the Secretary of the Treasury had a policy to sell Treasury gold bi-weekly as a sinking fund to gradually pay off the national debt. This infusion of cash kept the US dollar stable, something that was extremely necessary given the dollar fluctuated wildly in wake of the recent Civil War. Using President Grant's brother-in-law, Abel Corbin, they actually gained access to Grant and pushed the idea that government gold sales would actually hurt Western farmers. This pressure campaign they launched actually successfully and briefly paused routine Treasury gold sales, and as the government stayed out of the market, the conspirators aggressively bought gold through New York's gold room, driving prices higher and giving the impression that they had inside knowledge. Their public association with Grant further boosted their credibility on Wall Street. Once Grant realized that Gould and Fisk, though, were essentially exploiting his family ties and manipulating national policy for private gain, he ordered the Treasury to release about $4 million in gold on September 24th of 1869, the day now known as Black Friday. To be clear, the sudden sale of gold shattered the scheme, but as a result, gold prices collapsed almost instantly. The market buckled, and a brief but intense financial panic followed. Although the turmoil hurt many legitimate businesses and rattled the national economy, it didn't trigger a long-term depression or anything. And somehow in the midst of this, Gould and Fisk managed to escape prosecution, and Gould sold enough of his gold near the peak that he didn't lose much in the process. Now, following this first Black Friday, this term would resurface in 1951 with more staying power and a wider reach, when in the magazine Management and Maintenance, author M.J. Murphy used Black Friday to describe the day after Thanksgiving because so many sick calls came in from employees. This had a huge negative impact on productivity, and so he called it Black Friday, hinting that it was generally a bad day, using the term in the same way that Black Tuesday described the 1929 stock market crash, or that Black Insert the Day is used across the globe to refer to days where very bad things happened. Admittedly, I'm not sure if it's related at all to this first use, but the term Black Friday would re-emerge about 10 years later in Philadelphia, with the Philadelphia police calling the 2 days after Thanksgiving Black Friday and Black Saturday, because there was a lot of car traffic and foot traffic. This was in part due to a shopping frenzy like our modern Black Friday, but also because droves of people entered the city to watch the Army-Navy football game the following Saturday. The Philadelphia vendors actually thought this had a negative connotation, and they tried their little hearts out to rebrand the name as Big Friday, but that didn't stick. Anyhow, these are the 3 potential origins I think you could label as the inspirations for the pervasive term Black Friday. And while I'm sure some slaves were once sold at a discount before winter and that black and red ink were used to denote profits and losses, I don't think any of these stories are really anything more than folklore, with the real origins of the term being decidedly more complex. Next, we're going to talk about one of the most important cultural figures in American history that you've probably never heard of, a woman named Sarah Josepha Hale. When it comes to Thanksgiving, she, far more than the Pilgrims, should probably be the person you're thanking. So let's back up and get some context. Sarah Josepha Hale was born in New Hampshire in 1788. Unusually for the time, she received a solid education, thanks in part to her parents, and a brother who shared what he learned from Dartmouth. She later married a lawyer, David Hale, too, who fully supported her intellectual ambitions. But tragedy struck early. After only 9 years of marriage, he died suddenly, leaving Sarah a widow with 5 children to support. So, naturally, she turned to writing, and her 1830 collection, Poems for Our Children, contained a little nursery rhyme you may have heard of, too, titled Mary Had a Little Lamb. Yes, that Mary Had a Little Lamb, the one every preschooler on Earth sings. That was written by her. A few years later, she became the editor of Godey's Ladies' Book, which was basically the Vogue, Pinterest, and Martha Stewart Living of the 19th century, all fused into one. Under her leadership, the magazine reached about 150,000 subscribers, which was unheard of at the time, making her one of the most influential media figures in the country. Further, her influence stretched well beyond domestic advice. Hale used her platform to support women's education, helped push for the creation of Vassar College, advocated for historic preservation such as saving George Washington's Mount Vernon home, and supported the funding of the Bunker Hill Monument in Boston. Yes, she was pretty much everywhere, and in addition to everything else she did, Hale was a massive, borderline relentless advocate for establishing a national Thanksgiving holiday. Before the mid-1800s, Thanksgiving existed, but only in a weird and consistent patchwork way. It was mostly a New England tradition, and each state scheduled it independently. Some states celebrated in October, some in late November, others, especially in the South, didn't celebrate at all, dismissing it as a fussy, self-important Yankee holiday. But she didn't give up. Hale believed that Thanksgiving could be a unifying cultural tradition, one shared day of gratitude that might strengthen a nation pulling further apart year by year. So beginning in 1846, she launched a 17-year lobbying campaign. She wrote persuasive articles in Godey's Ladies' Book. She sent letters to 5 consecutive U.S. presidents over and over: Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, and finally Abraham Lincoln. She wrote to senators, governors, civic leaders, anyone with the power to influence a national holiday. Further, she pushed for the last Thursday in November to be the date, partly because it was the date that George Washington had chosen in 1789 when he proclaimed the first national day of Thanksgiving, and partly because Thursdays were already a common day for midsummer sermons. Churches often held midweek services then, so culturally it already felt like a day of reflection. Now, for years, nobody listened. Presidents ignored her letters, and nothing changed, until one day Abraham Lincoln read her appeal. At this point, it was 1863, the Civil War was raging, and Lincoln, always thinking about national healing, saw her idea not as a quaint New England custom, but as a symbolic act of unity. Thus, on October 3rd of 1863, Lincoln issued a proclamation establishing an annual national Thanksgiving to be observed on the last Thursday in November. Now, to be clear, this didn't yet make Thanksgiving a legal federal holiday. That wouldn't happen until the 20th century, but it did start the tradition of a president declaring Thanksgiving every year, and that tradition, that was entirely due to Sarah Josepha Hale. the widow, poet, editor, preservationist, and cultural architect who basically strong-armed the US government into giving America a holiday we now consider fundamental. So, next time you sit down with your turkey and stuffing, yes, you can thank the Pilgrims if you want, but you should probably save an extra helping of gratitude for Sarah Josepha Hale, the woman who turned Thanksgiving from a regional quirk into a national cornerstone. And at this point, that's basically the end of Sarah's story, but the Thanksgiving weirdness doesn't stop there. If anything, American history looked at one strange holiday tale and said, great, let's add some bureaucracy to the mix. So let's pick things back up where we left off in the last story, the looming federal legalization of Thanksgiving. Now in this story, we're in 1939, in the middle of the Great Depression. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt is juggling about 14 national emergencies at once. One of them, though, believe it or not, was the retail calendar. See, back then, retailers followed an unwritten rule: no Christmas advertising until after Thanksgiving. This was treated like a sacred tradition, like not talking about how dry the turkey is. But 1939 threw a curveball. Thanksgiving would fall on November 30th, the latest it could possibly land. That meant a painfully short Christmas shopping season, and a select few store owners begged Roosevelt to help stimulate the economy. More shopping days would mean more spending, which would mean more jobs, which hopefully meant the economy wouldn't be on fire for 5 minutes. So Roosevelt decided to do something bold and very annoying to some. He moved Thanksgiving back 1 week, from the last Thursday of November to the second to last Thursday of November. This new date would theoretically give everyone extra time to buy toys, sweaters, and whatever counted as holiday gifts during the Depression. Who knows, probably something like socks and oranges. And that's when the country collectively said, I'm sorry, he did what? Because here's the issue. For nearly 75 years, ever since Abraham Lincoln proclaimed the first National Day of Thanksgiving, Americans had treated the last Thursday of November as the holiday, even if it wasn't technically federal law yet. But tradition is practically a religion in America sometimes, so when Roosevelt changed the date, states started picking sides, literally. It was almost like its own little tradition-fueled civil war. See, 23 states obeyed Roosevelt, and they celebrated on the new date. 22 states refused out of pure spite and stuck with the old date, and Colorado and Texas, being Colorado and Texas, decided to celebrate both, possibly because they had a healthy appetite those years. And school calendars, football schedules, and parade committees, they were just utter chaos. Some contemporary newspapers started calling this new date Franksgiving. Merchants were confused, some families were furious, calendar markers had nervous breakdowns, and Congress, squinting at the mess, basically said, we can't keep doing this. So finally, in 1941, after 2 consecutive years of utter holiday nonsense, and with World War II looming, Congress stepped in and passed a law officially setting Thanksgiving as the 4th Thursday of November. Not Roosevelt's special extra early version, just the 4th. And anyhow, that's how a holiday built on myth, gratitude, and roasted birds nearly tore the nation in half, all because of Christmas shopping. Folks, before I wrap this video up, I just want to say this Thanksgiving, I am thankful for all of you. Life is tough sometimes, and it's not always easy dropping a video every week, but at the end of the day, I've got to say, it is so darn cool and awesome that I've got the chance to be T's Storytime. I appreciate you all, and I hope you enjoyed this video and have a happy Thanksgiving. Anyways, if you're thankful for me, all you've got to do is like, subscribe, and comment Gobble Gobble on the video. It's a quick way to tell YouTube that this channel is worth watching. Anyhow, whether you just made a turkey so dry that you could preserve that thing like a dinosaur for 1,000,000 years, or if you celebrated Thanksgiving a week early just like FDR would have loved, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.